I read a rather interesting article entitled Three Ways Humans Create Poverty by Kickel, Brewer, and Kirk. I found it so interesting that I read it 3 times and wasn't sure that I understood it, and finally decided to develop a set of relationship models to see if I could sort out what it said and help me to understand it. So I'd like to share with you what I ended up calling poverty by design, short-sightedness, wealth, and greed at work. Just when the medieval peasants didn't feel that their life could become any miserable, the wealthy merchants and aristocrats promoted a privatization of the commons, which reduced the commons, which removed the peasant livelihood, which displaced the peasants, which created a humanitarian crisis, promoting impoverished refugees, which promoted a slave labor force, which fueled the Industrial Revolution, making the wealthy merchants and aristocrats even more wealthy. So, that's one aspect. The next one was in the working class riots in Europe, because the living conditions were so bad, promoted class war, and in an endeavor to restore order, it promoted colonialism so that excess resources could be provided to the colonies, which provided opportunity, which diminished the working class riots. Though additionally, colonialism resulted in a privatization of the commons in the colonies, which dispossessed the indigenous inhabitants, which created impoverished refugees, creating a slave labor force, which provided resources to England and Europe, improving the standard of living, diminishing the working class riots. So rather than actually solve the problem, they simply transported the problem from England and Europe to the colonies, so that while life improved to some extent in England and Europe, it got tremendously worse in the colonies. For developing third world nations, they employed trade tariffs to create revenue to help develop prosperity of the country, though because they're still looking to continue to develop the country, they look to the IMF for assistance, and the IMF institutes structural adjustment programs, which promotes the country to remove the trade tariffs, which diminishes the prosperity of the country, and in addition, it encourages them to sell off the public utilities, which further diminishes the country, so that it ensures that the more aid that the developing nation seeks from the IMF, the more aid that they will need, and the worse off they will become. Interesting, isn't it? And then we have what was referred to as the enclosure movement, where the wealthy promoted things like NAFTA, which allowed cheap corn to Mexico, displacing farmers, increasing the poor population, which created sweatshop labor, which then further promoted the wealth of the wealthy. So that it's the enclosure movement in rerun, in terms of simply displacing individuals sort of develop or responsible for their own livelihood, turning them into essentially slave labor, which there's only one place for them to work since they've been moved off of their farms, and that's to work in the sweatshops for the wealthy. So, as it turns out, wealth has a tendency to create a context that promotes wealth. And that context promotes poverty, which further promotes the context. And while this looks like two reinforcing structures operating together, it's actually a single reinforcing structure where the wealthy create a context which promotes poor, which further supports the context which promotes the wealthy, and it's a poverty by design reinforcing structure that seems to repeat over and over again. So my question is, how do you get out of this vicious loop that essentially seems inevitable? Look forward to your comments. Bye.